In part one, we mentioned in this third point here that polls, the thing we're talking about, the thing we're trying to evaluate, is it good, is it bad, is it a crock? What they tend to like to report are the point estimates. That is, Trump has 50%, Hillary has 47%. But realistically, what they've done, and they report it just not as well, is some interval estimation. They've done interval estimation. So I want to do a quick review of what interval estimates look like, basically. Ours are a little simpler than what they'll use in a professional poll, but it gets you the idea. So let's travel back in time, about a week ago, and let's say we want to know the estimate of what percentage of Montana's voters wanted to vote for Trump. So we make a simplifying assumption. All adults in Montana vote. It's clearly not true, but I make that assumption now so I can discuss kind of later what might happen if that simplifying assumption isn't true. So we go out and we survey 400 Montanans at random, get a good representative sample. And of those Montanans, we found 216 say they supported Trump. Now I'm saying this is a hypothetical here, so I'm not saying we actually conducted this survey, right? But let's say we did that and that's what we got. Well, if we did that, we would have a point estimate of how many Montanans plan to vote for Trump. There are 216 Trump people out of 400 Montanans surveyed. That's 54% of the folks in our sample. And if 54% of the folks in our sample support Trump, our best point estimate is that 54% of all voters support Trump. And that's what typically gets the main stage in reporting of a poll. Now, what we also did, though, is we do some work with the confidence interval because we know the limitations of the point estimate. Basically, there has no measure of how good it is. Whereas when we go to an interval estimate, we have the width of the interval kind of giving us an idea of how good of an interval estimate it is, and a confidence level associated with that interval that also is a measure of the quality of the estimate. Okay? So what we do is we take it to a statistics package at this point. The statistics package we happen to use in class is StatCrunch. It calculates the standard error of this random variable p-hat. What p-hat means, it's our proportion of Trump voters. It accounts for the fact that if each of us in this class went out and sampled 400 Montanans, we'd come up with a slightly different proportion of people planning to vote for Donald Trump. That's just normal random variability. Okay? That variable called p-hat, that estimate we get, follows a normal distribution. Its mean is p, the true proportion of people who support Trump, and its standard deviation, or standard error we call it, is given by this formula, which you haven't seen much of because we've been relying on the StatCrunch procedure to actually calculate that. But there's a standard error that gets calculated. Furthermore, if we want 95% confidence, what we've been doing in our standard walled procedure that we use in StatCrunch is multiplying that by 1.96 to get a so-called margin of error. And so all of a sudden we know our margin of error is 4.8%. So the news might say, yeah, Donald Trump has 54% of Montanans vote according to this new poll with a margin of error of 4.8%. So they slide over that, but it might get reported. Okay? So we go in, we get those things, and then we come up. Okay, so again, this is how we got it in StatCrunch, going here, entering the information, and we get this lower limit and this upper limit. Basically, the lower limit is what happened when we took our point estimate. Okay, it doesn't show the point estimate here, and sub 0.54 is what it was though, and subtracted 0.0249. What happens when we take that point estimate and add 0.48, okay? 0.048. And so these are the two numbers. So what we come up with out of this is the following conclusion. We basically believe that Trump's support among all Montana voters, based on this fictitious sample, was 49% to 59%. He's somewhere between those two numbers. Furthermore, we are 95% confident in this belief. And what that 95% confidence means is that we basically used a procedure that tends to work on 95% of simple random samples of this size. What's coming up, by the way, is the fact that's where we're going to get into this idea of we had not just one election, but 50 elections. And relative to these elections, we have lots and lots and lots of different polls. And they all used procedures that work on roughly 95% of all samples. Well, that means 5% of those polls are going to miss the target. We won't know which until election day. Now we can sort of look back. But what we would expect is that some are going to miss. About 5% should miss. Okay? And so, given those pieces of information, we'll pause the video here. And the next video we'll talk about Real Clear Politics, their polls the day before the election that they published, and their election results that they published on another page of the website. And we'll compare and talk about how the polls did.